happen.
Yes.
But we will be live. We are live on Facebook, and I am now going to start this recording, and we are in gallery view. Okay, and I'm going to leave it there. All right. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Good evening. Good afternoon, I should say. Welcome to our roundtable discussion, which will be a critical discussion about the woman, the Canaanite woman in Matthew chapter 15. I am your host, Reverend Dr. Mitzi Smith, and I'm also the J. Davison Phillips Professor of New Testament at Columbia Theological Seminary. The story of the Canaanite woman in Matthew 15 is considered, of course, by scholars as a revision of the story of the Syrophoenician woman in the Gospel of Mark, since Mark is considered the first gospel written among the synoptics. Biblical scholarship, of course, discourages the harmonizing of the two stories. But how did the author of Matthew revise and contextualize or recontextualize this story? What difference does it make who reads it? What difference does it make how we read it? And from our diverse cultural perspectives and individual experiences. So I will moderate this round table of our fine, wonderful panelists and experts in terms of their fields and their professions. And they will speak from their own perspectives and contexts, and hopefully inspire each other with the diversity and the differences that we bring. For our listeners, some of you who may not have read the story recently, I'm first going to read the story, then I'm going to introduce our panelists. From the New Revised Standard Version. Jesus left that place and went away to the district of Tyre and Sidon. Just when a Canaanite woman from the region came out and started shouting, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon." But he did not answer her at all. And his disciples came and urged him, saying, "Send her away, for she keeps shouting after us." And he answered, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and she knelt before him, saying, "Lord, help me." And he answered, "It's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to dogs." And she said, "Yes, master, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." And then Jesus answered her, "Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish." And her daughter was healed instantly. Our panelists in alphabetical order are, and you might wave when I call your name, Reverend Tonya R. Bryan. Is a licensed minister at the Community Baptist Church in Englewood, New Jersey, and an adjunct professor at Pillar College, where she teaches community development and service in the Master of Ministry Leadership Program. She earned an MDiv from New York Theological Seminary and a Master of Sacred Theology from Drew University. Dr. Sharon Jacob is the assistant professor of New Testament at Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, California. She is the author of Reading Mary Alongside Indian Surrogate Mothers, Violent Love, Oppressive Liberation, and Infancy Narratives. Dr. Lalitha Jayachitra, coming to us from India, where it is midnight, is an ordained minister of the Church of South India a New Testament scholar and Christian feminist theologian. Dr. Jayachitra is founder and director of the Ecclesia Center of Biblical and Pastoral Accompaniment, where I was happy to be one of her lecturers. I think her first lecturer. She's doing wonderful work there. She is the co-editor of 2 books, including Teaching All Nations, Interrogating the Matthew Great Commission, which we worked together on. Dr. Jennifer T. Kaalund is the assistant, welcome Jennifer, professor of religious studies at Iona College, and the author of a very recent book that you need to get, Reading Hebrew and First Peter with the African American Great Migration, Diaspora, Place, and Identity. And you can get it on Amazon. Dr. Angela N. Park, assistant professor of New Testament and Greek here in the Atlanta or Decatur area at the McAfee School of Theology at Mercer University. And we are getting ready to sign a contract to edit Bitter the Chastening Rod, a follow-up to Stony the Road. Pastor Queen Teris, did I pronounce that right? Teris, yes, is a pastor and a womanist, theologian, and community organizer. Reverend Teris found her compassion at the early age of 15, volunteering as a peer educator for Black teenage girls while working for a program teaching strategies of abstinence and safe sex negotiation negotiation for the HIV/AIDS prevention grant. And I've met her on Facebook, and she is quite a presence, calling for critique, a necessary critique of womanism. Dr. M. Adryael, did I pronounce that right?
It's Adryael, yeah.
Adryael Tong is also in the neighborhood. She is an assistant professor of New Testament and early Christian scriptures at the Interdenominational Theological Center here in Atlanta, Georgia. She works primarily on the creation of Jewish-Christian difference through the parting of the ways. She is especially interested in the processes by which religious difference becomes inscribed in historical memory as bodily difference. Sounds fascinating. Last but not least, Reverend, I keep everybody here wants to make you a doctor. Reverend Donna, must be a reason, Vanhook earned her bachelor's in religious studies with a minor in human services at Elon University. I'm telling you, she has really been diligent in making sure our works get in that library, Womanist works. And an MDiv from Shaw University School of Divinity. She is an ordained Baptist minister. Yes, Shaw, shout out to Shaw. She is an ordained Baptist minister who serves as a United Church of Christ associate pastor in full standing at the Union Chapel UCC Church in Burlington, North Carolina. Reverend Vanhook is a womanist community organizer, a co-educator, and a former certified law enforcement officer in the flesh. So we will start, I would like to start our roundtable with asking each of you if you would, not in any particular order, but if you would talk about the lens that you bring to this discussion and what difference it makes in reading this story. Dr. Jacobs, just smiling. You want to start? But then maybe we'll go around. I don't know if we have the same order here. Go ahead.
All right. So this passage, of course, is really, really fascinating because it is a very difficult portrayal of Jesus. And so in that sense, you know, it is a challenging passage to read and interpret. With regards to the lens I bring, you know, I of course have grew up in India, and then I have lived here for 20 plus years now. It feels really long. So the lens that I bring is post-colonial feminist criticism, and also whiteness theory, and particularly the idea of how post-colonial and the desire to be white, you know, forms my understanding of growing up in the Indian context and then living here, and how immigrants struggle with their own identity and their subjectivities in this context. So that's the lens I bring to this text.
Okay, wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Pastor Donna.
My lens is based upon the work that I do in community as a womanist community organizer. So I bring the Black woman's perspective to all of the work that I do and ministry that I do. And predominantly, I just happen to go, have been in predominantly male-dominated careers and work, especially in law enforcement. But bringing all that to the table as a Black woman is very interesting, because where I live, a lot of Black women are not in areas of power or leadership in certain ways. So we have women who are leaders of churches, but mostly as Black women, they have started their own. So they're independent, kind of like nonprofit organizations. So I bring all that to the table, also having a degree in nonprofit management, and being able to critically think about ministry and community work from a Black woman's perspective. And so that sometimes gets me in trouble because I am willing to put myself in a position to advocate for persons who are the least of these, including myself. And all of me comes to the table wherever I sit.
Wonderful. Dr. Tong.
For this passage that I've recently revisited, right, I bring Dr. Stephanie Buchanan Crowder's Womanist maternal lens for the interpretation. So leaning into the fact that this woman is a mother, and what that also means for the entire community. So that's the lens through which I'll be talking about this passage.
Okay, Dr. Tong, thank you.
Hi. So I think the lens that I bring to this passage that might be sort of different is I will be reading this passage within the Jewish tradition, and specifically pointing out the ways in which Matthew is itself a Jewish reconstruction of history, and how the like typical anti-Jewish readings of this passage, which are many, are sort of like at odds with the entire point that Matthew's trying to make about sort of like the nature of historical Israel.
Okay. Pastor Teris.
You know, I'm sitting here thinking that the lens I'm bringing is the ability to assert oneself, to assert your agenda, regardless of the disadvantages of the circumstance. This is what I see in her. And I guess that's what I'm bringing to the table.
Okay, wonderful. Dr. Parker.
Thank you. I think the lens that I constantly read this particular passage through is a womanist lens that pays attention to intersectionality, thinking about Kimberly Crenshaw and really wanting to put the aspect of Black women, I kind of think about similar to Reverend Donna Vanhook, just thinking through Black women and the question of, well, what do we do with a Black woman? Because I think intersectionality asks that question specifically when Kimberly Crenshaw coined it, to think through, hey, we can think about white men or white women, we can think about Black men, but there's this thing with Black women and gender and ethnicity that come together that oftentimes people don't know what to do with. And so with that being said, the other thing that I do is I try to decenter Jesus a little bit, because when you think about the particular Calvinist readings of this text, people were like, oh, well, Jesus is increasing her faith and it's Jesus doing a good thing for the woman, and not really thinking about how the woman is actually taking her agency, taking forth her agency to be a mother, thinking through Stephanie Buchanan Crowder's lens as well, to be an advocating mother for a daughter as well, and what that means and what that looks like. So that's the lens.
Okay, Reverend Tonya.
And so the lens in which I will be viewing this text is from the perspective of the Christian woman within the African-American church context, who has heard so much of the culture and the language that is really not acceptable, but is more abusive and violent towards women. And then thinking about intersectionality and Kimberly Crenshaw's work in Say Her Name. I have a background in policy as well. And so looking at international policies and also how they impact local policies as well. So that's the lens in which I'm viewing this text.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Chitra.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to employ post-colonial feminist perspective on this passage to see how the self is identified while continuously constructing the other in this passage, the contrast between self and the other. I would also like to bring Indian readings specifically from anti-casteist perspectives, and how women's lives are being labeled depending on the periphery in which they are situated. Yeah.
Okay. So going to the text, and one thing, of course, that stands out for us is the fact that Matthew has changed her name to Canaan. I mean, her the way he identifies her, right? As instead of Syrophoenician, he uses the term Canaanite, right? So what does that evoke for you? What does that say to each of you? What do you want to say about that? Let's start with Dr. Tong and see what.
Yeah, actually, thank you for asking, because I have thought a lot about this. So one of the most important things about Matthew is that he opens with a really interesting genealogy that includes 3 non-Jewish women, and in fact 3 Canaanite women. Mm-hmm. So the women who Matthew includes in his genealogy, in particular to trace the lineage of Jesus, but also to trace the lineage of Jesus through David, is specifically Canaanite. Mm-hmm. And so I believe that the reason why she is changed from a Syrophoenician woman to a Canaanite woman is in fact to harmonize her character with the rest of Matthew's ideology about the sort of closed openness of Israel, which is what enables the Messiah's mission to stretch beyond sort of the boundaries of Israel to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's interesting term, closed openness. Are you getting that in ambivalence in terms of how she is portrayed, in terms of the relationship between Israel? There was the good and there is the not so good, or there is the inclusive and not. I mean, and can we? So I don't want to. I'll come back to you and see if someone else in the meantime, while you're thinking about it, wants to say something about her Canaanite. Her identification as a Canaanite. Anyone else?
Well, I mean,
yes,
can I jump in? So yeah. One of the things I think of is, the author of Matthew definitely has Canaanite women in his genealogy, and then he has this Canaanite woman in this story. And it makes me want to think about how does he view women who are from foreign origins? And what does foreignness look like? Is there some kind of ambivalence, as you just said, in the ways in which the author, through the lens and through the characterization of Jesus, is viewing foreign women, foreign women's bodies, foreign women's voices, and interaction between the two? So to me, that is really interesting, with the Canaanite, and to piggyback of what Dr. Jayachitra was saying, the self and the other, and in post-colonial terms, they're meeting in this contact zone, right, where this conversation is happening, and how does that come about? So to me, the foreignness of this woman is what stands out.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, to continue with what Sharon said, by introducing this woman as Canaanite, the contrast between Jesus and this woman as belonging to two different ethnicity or race is brought out very explicitly. Jesus as a person who has come to save the lost sheep of the Jews, and a woman who is not fitting in line with any of this racial identity of Jesus is portrayed here. So the identities of these two main characters are introduced in this passage.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah.
And so many of us want to jump in.
Yes, so Pastor Teris, then we'll come to Dr. Kaalund, and then Dr. Parker. Yes, Pastor Teris.
Yeah, she even uses that. It's so obvious that she uses that tension as the contrast to set him up to respond as the moral authority. You know what I'm saying? It's almost like she approaches it with this, oh, okay, so you're going to refer to me like that. Okay, this again, do I have to, are we going to, am I yet entrapped in the carnal leanings of hierarchy, even with you, Lord,
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes, thank you, Dr. Kaalund.
I want to point out, though, the Canaanite in this particular case could be, right, if we're looking at it historically, reminding us of Israel's enemies, right? And so I'll point to a contemporary example for us to think about the way in which we may be thinking of, and I want to also, as I think Dr. Jacob mentions, kind of decenter Jesus in this narrative, but the visceral response that one might have to one's enemy, as the Israelites have come and conquered their land, right? And so I think there's also that historical perspective that's important, in the same way that some of us, myself included, might have a visceral response to the red hat, right? I had to get real close to red hats now to know what might be on the front or the side or the back. And then when it's Trump or 2020 in particular, right? It's a visceral response that I have. Is this person my enemy? And then how do I posture myself in this response, in this, right? And I think that's the posturing we see in this text, is someone who is supposed to be my enemy has come to me, has cried out, has shouted me down, essentially. And how do I respond?
So I like that you say could be, because it's interesting that Jesus could be seen as having that type of visceral response, and yet Matthew gives you this genealogy that's supposed to say otherwise.
Exactly.
Right? So Dr. Parker.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point, because we've talked about decentering Jesus in this reading, but I also think that there's a mode of her identity as Canaanite that actually deconstructs Jesus in this reading. And when I say deconstructs Jesus, I want to go back to the post-colonial idea of a self coming in contact with an other that actually says, oh, you're really not an other, you are part of me. And once Jesus has to say, you are part of me, then he has to actually check himself a little bit. And that's what people don't want to think about, the possibility that Jesus could actually have to check himself for a moment.
Yeah, yes, yes. Did I see you, Dr. Donna? I see you want to say something, Donna.
Yes. Oh my God, what she just said. And the Canaanite woman referenced in Matthew calls Jesus son of David and Lord. And I think in terms of you can catch you can how's that saying go? You get more honey with
with honey, you can get back, you can anyway, that's me, but I can't think of it either. But I know
Get more flies with honey.
You can get more flies with honey, y'all. You can get
we know what you're talking about.
honey.
Thank you. Thank you for that help. And so by acknowledging that, I think, which is different from the Mark text, I think it, again, someone said it sets him up. She's, you know, appealing to his position that she puts him in. And I think that puts her in a position to challenge him later and to say, okay, I know who you are, but what about this? So I like that Matthew puts that in there, and although Mark does not, in reference to the son of David.
Yeah, so there's a pattern in there. So this is my question a little bit, going back to this, and then we can move on this, unless somebody has something else to say, Dr. Tong or somebody on this point, because I know she was mentioning this openness and this closeness, sort of. But this genealogy saying that part of you, and we didn't need this genealogy, of course, to tell us that they all mixed up, right? That part of you. But this emphasis is being made on the contribution of Canaanite women, at least, to the bloodline, right? So when you come in contact with this person who is part of you, and you perhaps treat them in negative ways, you know, we may be even start to talk about a sort of a self-loathing and the self-hatred that can come through in terms of colonized bodies, right?
So I wanted to actually jump in here with a sort of modern or contemporary example, which I think the pandemic has sort of emphasized the extent to which we're all connected. And so, for example, in the early days of the pandemic, actually in February, I had a pretty racist incident where I was wearing a face mask because I had been asked to I was actually at the hospital because I donated bone marrow, and they were doing tests to make sure that I was safe to donate. And so I was wearing a mask in the hospital, and a man made really disparaging comments about you know, the coronavirus. But now most of our PPE is coming from China. And so I think it's really interesting that the virus came from China, but so is everything to protect us with. And so it's this weird, this is why I talk a lot about open closeness or closed openness, which is like a really basic post-colonial sort of understanding of subjectivity. But I think it's something that we are actually experiencing now, where we're realizing that even in our closeness, we are always open, you know, whether it's open to these diseases, or at the same time, in this closeness, we are also open in as much as like there is protection and aid and all these other things as well.
Yes, thank you. So let's go to her other identity as a mother, right? And perhaps even how those two, her ethnicity and her social identity as a parent comes to the fore. So I'm going to start with Dr. Kaalund, who's using the maternal. Yes.
Yes, one of the things that Dr. Buchanan does in her When Mama Speaks text, where she explores this actual passage, is she highlights the fact, one, that this woman is a mother, but she's an advocate, right? So it's not even that she's approaching Jesus on her own behalf, right? She approaches Jesus, and I say approaches, she shouts Jesus down until she gets his attention, advocating not for herself, but for her daughter. And interestingly, what Dr. Crowder does, the turn she makes here in her reading of this is that advocacy is work, right? Is she equates that to Black women's work and the way in which Black women advocate for our children. And I would like to expand that understanding of children to the community, right? Not just my physical, biological children, but our children, to the children in the community. And I think that is one of the actually kind of inspiring, if we have to find a hero in the story, right? If we have to identify a hero, clearly a heroine is this Canaanite woman, right? And it is the work that she does on behalf of her child or on behalf of children. And in that way, it's inspiring.
Yes.
And that she's her request is granted. Right. So in all the justice work we're doing, right, in the ways that we are trying to advocate for the children. And again, Dr. Tong, thank you for that pandemic example, because I think it resonates so well on so many levels, particularly as we're talking about issues of intersectionality and all of the things that have been unveiled or revealed as a result of it, that I think highlights all of these issues of intersexuality, whether it's socioeconomic status, gender, or race. We find all of that, I think, in this text, and the importance of advocacy and the effect that it can have on our communities, I think, is what this Canaanite woman makes clear for me.
Yes, and I think that's powerful to point out. I think we could point out too the fact that her shouting is a pattern we find in one way she fits a pattern we find in Matthew. Right, that certain people come shouting and they shout the same words, but the treatment of her is different, right? The shouting is the same, right? It matters. It matters sometimes that it's a Canaanite woman shouting, right? It matters that the pushback is coming from a Black woman, right? Or from a non-white woman. It matters. Sometimes it's just the person who is shouting, who is pushing back, who she represents, who she is, that is the problem, and not the shout, right? Because we have this shout all over Matthew, but it becomes a problem with her, right? Pastor Teris.
Yeah, and as a mom, I'm just here with this house full of football players and rappers that are my children as well. I'm sitting here thinking that the scripture says in 23, Jesus did not answer a word. And we have that playing over and over in our communities as mothers, as Black mothers. And we are screaming out, we are crying, and nobody's answering a word. But see, the key thing about this, and from, we're talking about police to government officials, to people are not directly in the seats of authority responding to our direct need and concern. There's not one word being said. And see, then when she continues to move forward, she already has a strategy. This is what I don't want us to miss. The fact that she, whatever humble way she got to come. See, Tupac said that if I keep on, I was asking nicely, but because you was ignoring me, now I got to scream. And so here, even in her screaming, there's still the strategy. A sister said that you can get more flies with honey. There's that part, but then there's the other part of there's the challenges that I think is very much just like womanism today. We have look at Jesus as Christianity, and then look at womanism as we have challenged it to not only to expand the parameters of privilege to include everyone. That is not only on the aspect for mothers. It's not only for all of these other children that they have mothers, or the mothers are somewhere else that are in my house right now. We are all these communal mothers, and our positioning with that has been embodied, I think, her response, her strategic response.
Yes. So before we get to the end, yes.
I wanted to.
Yes, we'll go to Dr. Parker, then Pastor Bryan.
Okay. I wanted to see if we could connect this woman and the screaming that we're hearing to Taylor.
To say that again?
To Breonna Taylor.
Yes, yes.
In Kentucky. We have to, because I'm mindful of this passage and the woman screaming after Jesus. And you have to remember that she is a non-Jewish person. And the chapter 8 with the Roman centurion, who Jesus, when that person asks him, can you heal my slave? Jesus says, oh, okay, come on, I'll go to your house. The man says, no, I'm a man of power and authority. So I say a word and it happens. You're a man of power and authority. You say a word, it will happen. Why is it that Black women got to scream for Black women to be healed? Because when we think about Black Lives Matter, oftentimes we think about men, but we have to scream for the women and the daughters as well.
That's right.
That's sitting with me.
It's like we have to weaponize our voices, weaponize our trauma, right? Yes, Pastor Bryan.
And also in verse 23, where the disciples are urging Jesus not to pay her attention because she keeps crying out. And that speaks to advocacy. Advocacy is work, right? Advocacy when we advocate for one child or for one system, we are advocating for the entire community, for the policy change for the entire community. And so, as Dr. Parker has stated, we have to remember the women, right? Breonna Taylor and all the other women who have succumbed to the hands of police, right? Or white supremacists. And we as women have to advocate on their behalf, because if we realize Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd were all murdered the same time as Breonna Taylor. Yes. We see that there have been changes and arrests made. No one has been arrested in Breonna Taylor's case. And so we have to continue as women of color to cry out and to continue to scream and lend our voices until change happens, because I believe that we have not seen the patriarchal constructs really advocate on behalf of Breonna Taylor. And so for them, the work has been done because there have been arrests made for men, right? But what happens to the women?
The women have no justice. And it reminds me also of Sandra Bland, is where it's kind of started for me. I mean, I'm sure there were many before her, but Sandra Bland, right? People criticized her for her mouthiness, right? For her getting excited when she's been treated unjustly, or and so this reminds me of her too, right? It goes back to, the disciples jump in, and I think it's interesting. I didn't want to center them, but Jesus' silence, it seems like, emboldens them, right? Yeah. Jesus' in silence emboldens them, because as soon as he's silent, then they think they can jump in. Sharon.
Yeah, so, just jumping off of what Dr. Parker and Dr. Bryan were saying, when you compare Jesus' response to the centurion, right, there is a heaven and earth difference.
Yes.
And I wonder if it's also helpful to recognize the way in which colonization affects all of us, right? How we internalize our colonization. And so here you have Jesus, a colonized person who is unable to see past his own colonization and unable to see past his own discrimination, till he's reminded by the woman, hey, wait a minute, I am in you and you are in me. And that's that moment of, the eyes opening up. But we do that, right? We're so much part of the system that we are all raising voices for the men who have been killed in Black Lives Matter, and completely forget about women. And women too, we're all complicit in that. So how are we deconstructing our own internal colonization?
Yes, yeah. And we cannot forget the author, whoever the author is. Right? That he has a big role. in this colonization project here, right? And as I've said elsewhere, I truly believe Matthew was a slave master. I truly do. So what about her daughter? How do you read her daughter in light of the lens that you bring? How do you, what do you have to say about her daughter?
May I introduce the strong Black woman and thoughts about that? So I think in terms of my mother, I haven't, I was a foster parent for a few years, but I've never had a child, and I have numerous nieces and nephews that I'm auntie to. But I think in terms of my mom and her persistence in, she had 7 children, virtually by herself. And her persistence, her resources that she had, this woman found resources in her voice. And provided her own agency. I like how she came, I think I heard somebody say with a strategy. She was a strategist. So she had a plan A, but she had a plan B. And she was not going to take down. So I love how she continued pressing her way. With the strong Black woman, with the mass resources in order to accomplish what it is that she would have to do in community with not just her family, but with persons who she's connected to. So with this particular woman being persistent, we don't know who she helped later on further than her own family. So when we as Black women put our hands to the plow and continue being persistent, I think we can make change. That's how Black Lives Matter started, with 3 Black women. And so, however, I'm kind of twisted about that because of the nature of who is advocated for. And generally it is Black men, Black boys. And so I appreciate the Say Her Name is more than a hashtag. I appreciate that Say Her Name is a movement. It has not taken off like Black Lives Matter. However, it's up to us to continue to help that to progress and advance. We have to keep, I used recently Hope in the Hollow, Elaine Crawford, I believe.
Yes.
And so, and she goes back in time of our history as Black women being persistent and relying on God to be there for us. And so we know that God will make a way out of no way, but we also have to put our hand to the plow. And so for us to put some steam behind this Say Her Name that is more than a hashtag, we have to really, I think, pull together, continue to use our collective voice, which is very powerful. I don't think we really realize how much power we have in our voice, but to continue to use our voice and be persistent in moving that forward. So we can't stop now. And that's why I think Breonna Taylor has not gotten her justice. We just got to be persistent and continue to press.
I like that emphasis you're putting there, because it makes me think about this juxtaposition of her voice and her faith, right? And it is really her shout, it seems. But then Jesus says, "Great is your faith." I have a problem with that. We'll talk about that. But so the daughter, right? The way she is characterized, right? Her need as someone who is tormented by a demon. Can we talk about that in historical context, in contemporary context?
So one of the things I find really interesting about this passage is that there's actually 2 children. There's the daughter, and then there's the metaphor of the children from the table, or the children eating the food at the table that they then throw to the dogs. And one of the things that I always find so interesting and like really inspiring about the Canaanite woman's response is she doesn't say, "Oh, well, we should take the bread away from the
Mhm.
children.
Mhm.
Like we should have the bread instead. Like she says there is enough to go around, and it's only your weird like assumption that there's scarcity that's causing like this weird way of like keeping some people out. And some of the things that we are like, whether it's discussions around UBI or various things like universal healthcare, there's this constant like objection by saying like, oh, but there isn't enough. And it's like, well, but you know, what kinds of imaginations can we think about and priorities can we put in place that prioritize like not this like ideas of scarcity, but actually thinking about ways that like there can be enough for everybody.
Yeah, that's a great point, and especially when you think about the feeding of the 5,000 that comes after this story, right? yeah. Thank you, Sharon.
I
sorry.
see
Go ahead.
here,
Go ahead, Dr. Jayachitra.
Okay, so one of you two. Okay.
Okay. I see the ambivalence of the sides of power being changed from time to time. When this discussion begins, we see Jesus talking to this woman, not as a powerless, but as a woman coming from the region of Tyre, which could be the storage place of all the crops or the harvest of harvest under the Roman imperial government. So a place where there is abundance of food, abundance of bread is there. And Jesus initiates this conversation where that a food security issue is involved, where the Palestinian farmers had to harvest for the Roman imperial government, and then the storage is assured for the Canaanites who would identify themselves as Gentiles with the Romans. Now, in such a situation, we see the side of power is more in line with the Canaanite woman. But that immediately changes to the powerlessness of or the vulnerability of the Canaanite woman in asking for the healing for her daughter, where the imagery of bread is brought in. So we see the sides of power is in tension with the inherent power within this woman, where she also gets into this hybrid intersectional identity of having lots of food in contrast to the Palestinian Jews or the colonized Jews who don't have enough on their plates. So we see this vulnerability of this woman is juxtaposed with the abundance of food that is available to her. And perhaps we can see how this food imagery or the bread imagery is brought in here to talk about the varying levels of power displayed in this narrative.
Thank you, Dr. Sharon.
So, you know, one of the things that I like about this passage, given my own background coming from an Indian context, is the fact that she is defending her daughter, right? She's an advocate for her daughter. Yeah, you know, in a context where, you know, when a girl child is born, she's usually considered a burden, and you know, you just want to get rid of her as soon as possible. And here you have an example of a mother who is willing to fight for her daughter and go the extra mile and, you know, take on the so-called guy and is unafraid. So in that sense, the message to me when I read this text is that, you know, our daughters matter. Our daughters' bodies matter. Our daughters' voices matter. And very often, you know, coming from my context, we are taught to privilege the son, right? Not our daughters. So to me, that really is, you know, something that really stands out to me about this woman who's a strong mother and a voice for her daughter.
Yes. Yeah, that's good. I think, so what ails her daughter, right, is also at the center. So what ails our daughters matter, right? I'm often struck that demon, the so-called demon possession, could very well be a catch-all for a lot of ailments, right? That just like in our society, come up with a disease because they don't know what to do with it. So, I mean, cancer could be a whole lot of things, but it's called cancer. Lupus, we do know is a whole lot of things, but it's called, so we don't. But it has to be this boogeyman, this eternal boogeyman, right? But which can be poverty. Right? which can be poverty, which can be xenophobia, which can be, in our case, Trump. And I'm serious, even though I laugh. Yeah, so what ails her? It could be sexism, it could be racism, it could be the intersection of them all, right? This demon that is tormenting them, right? And all of that is demonic. Xenophobia, racism, sexism, transphobia, all that is demonic, right? And you don't need a boogeyman to tell you so, right? And it has a debilitating, it torments us. It causes mental distress, physical distress, spiritual distress. And thinking of that, I guess we would, unless someone else wanted to go somewhere else. What about this great faith? Do I don't think there's another person in Matthew who said they have great faith. Is this good or is this bad?
I'm sorry. I'm still thinking about the daughter just for one moment.
Okay, go ahead.
I'll tell you the reason why I'm thinking about the daughter. I'm thinking about the daughter because I'm sitting here perplexed about Jesus. Does Jesus call the mother daughter when he says, "Great is your faith"?
I don't think so.
No. Okay. No. He said he calls her woman. Great is your faith. All right.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I have to think about it. My mind's going. I'll think about it a little bit more. So go to your next point, Dr. Smith.
Yeah, so I'm wondering if we could think about that. Why is she the only character in Matthew and happens to be a Canaanite, happens to be this woman in this predicament, who said, because of your great faith, right? And I'm sorry, it just makes me think of respectability politics, that she has to have great faith, right? That it has to be attributed to great faith, that this happens for her, right? And of course, we take that and run with it in terms of our theologies, right? That you need to have, never mind the fact that he feeds all those people because of his compassion, right? After this story, never mind that you guys pointed out Cornelius and his, who was it? I'm sorry, not Cornelius. What's his name? The guy with the slave who needed
the Roman centurion.
So, and there's all these people where faith is not even mentioned, but why with her? Why does that have to be the case here, right? And we also get this saying that comes up in Matthew as well, is all you need is the faith of a mustard seed and you can move mountains. So why does what she does have to be labeled as great faith? Yes. So we'll go to Angela and then Lalitha. Jayachitra.
I think the way that she takes on the language of the dog, which leads to Jesus saying, "Great is your faith." So that's problematic. And I think that's where I'm seeing what the question that you're asking, Dr. Smith, about the respectability politics. Because no matter what, even if, as some scholars try to say, well, he didn't call her a dog, he called her a puppy. And so some scholars put that in their commentaries, but a dog is a dog or a bee is a bee, even say a little bee or a big bee. So it's problematic because I think she takes on the language of, okay, fine, I'm a bee. I'm a bee for crying out and yelling to you. And Jesus says, "Great is your faith." And so I don't think I've really seen the problematic nature of that until now. So thank
Lalitha.
Yeah, I see the term dog. I mean, the faith of this woman is appreciated, but a little while ago she was termed as a dog. In for Canaanites, I mean, who eat all meat. For instance, if we compare the lifestyle of Jewish people who have a lot of restrictions about their food habits, who don't eat all meat, and for Canaanites who are like dogs who treat all meats as equal, who can take any meat. I mean, if that exegetical point is brought in, somebody who is looked down upon as equal to dog, or like I would bring in the kind of labeling, especially in relation to calling out names for women in the background of the power structures and the systems in which we are part of, is something that that is very, very crucial in this passage. Labeling women, despite their intense faith that she portrays in this passage, is very, very disturbing. So whatever a woman could claim as her credibility in a power structure is, still her identity could be brought down to a level of derogation, to a derogatory term like dog, where her identity is brought into question. That is very, very disturbing in this passage.
Yeah, you know, why isn't the need of her daughter enough? Right, to hear her. Somebody recently, I don't know, it was Kimberly Crenshaw's. I think it was, and she asked the question: why do Black women have to be magical to be noticed, right? And why does this woman have to have great faith for Jesus to have compassion if it is him, right? We could say that her healing comes about because of her daughter, not because of Jesus, right? Mm-hmm. And I know many of us, some of us find that problematic. And then there's the theology that Jesus is testing her. What do you have to say to that, right? Jesus is testing her. What is your response to that when this story is read as Jesus was testing her? Yes, Tonya.
So I just want to go back to where Jesus references the woman as the dog, right? Because that is very problematic. And in our society, through our culture, through movies, television, you know, pop culture, that has come to be an acceptable term. Mm-hmm. And I believe it's important, even from a womanist lens, to really lift this text to show how problematic it is, mm-hmm. and not to justify the language because it's
right. That's right. Yeah.
Right. And because it's Jesus, we want to negate the fact that even though culturally Gentiles were referred to as little dogs, it's still not acceptable. So even though we hear this language within our society and culture, there has to be some type of emphasis to say this is not acceptable. Mm-hmm. So I just
so even if you call it a metaphor, it doesn't make it acceptable, right? Even if you see it as a metaphor.
Exactly.
Yes, Dr. Kaalund.
So, I mean, so we read this as we should all passages. We're not just going to read a few verses out of chapter 15, right? We should read it within the context of the entire chapter. And then again, as many of us have already pointed out, within the context of what the writer of Matthew is trying to do. And so one of the things that I found interesting when I was going back and revisiting this passage is that at the beginning of chapter 15, as Jesus is having a confrontation with the Pharisees and the scribes of Jerusalem, it says, right? And they are telling Jesus that his disciples aren't washing their hands, and so they are not following God's commands. And then Jesus gives this parable, right? That kind of out of the mouth comes the issues of the heart. Mm-hmm. And a few verses later, out of his mouth comes an insult to this woman, right? Yes. And so what is, it's not so much a challenge or repentance of the woman as it is of Jesus in this text, right? If we're reading Matthew as a gospel, some call it the teaching gospel, right? Right? What do I learn from this? It's Jesus who is learning in this passage. It is out of his heart that this insult came, right? If we think about colonization in that context that we were talking about, if we think about the fact that we're talking about an oppressed people speaking down on another oppressed person, potentially, right? It is out of his heart that this insult has come. And it is not so much, I think, the great faith of the woman, is as it is the turning of the heart of Jesus, right? To say, okay, you checked me, right? You have properly checked me, right? And now he can proceed with the rest of his mission. The learning came from Jesus, in my opinion. In the rest of this, right, what has happened is we've seen a very example of this, that the parable, right? I think it's Peter who says, can you break that down? My translation, right? Can you break that down for us, Jesus? Because we don't understand what you're saying here, right? And so Jesus is saying, what I'm saying, it doesn't matter what you eat. Right, back thinking about the bread again, and then the miracle that would happen later. It doesn't matter what you put in your body; it's what comes out of your mouth that really matters.
That's right. Yeah. So
those words do matter.
Yeah. So I think it's the same. It's the same context in Mark, but I think in Mark it's easier to see that Jesus is the one being taught. Right. I think Matthew tries to mask that with other language, right? It's very clear, at least to me, it's much more straightforward that he is being taught, right? But here, right, all these other layers are put on, I think, that maybe is trying to tell a different story, right? I think, perhaps. Somebody else comments.
I like those last two comments. And also, I go back to how she seemed to know, as we would say, what's up. And within the context, also pointed out, it says that, but Peter said to him, explain this parable to us. Then he said, are you also still without understanding? Many times the disciples just didn't get it. And so I find it fascinating that a lot of times women got it. And they were able to put 2 and 2 together, make 4. And so I'm really impressed with her being able to be in dialogue with the Lord, as she says, with the son of David, and hold her own. So I love that part about it. And we see that also in other scriptures with women who were mothers. I'm thinking about the Shunammite woman. And things that happen in her processes, and different women in the Book of Kings, the widow in 2 Kings 4, 1 and 7, the widow of Sidon, how you pronounce that?
Oh, Sidon, yeah.
Yeah, Zarephath, the different ways that they were persistent in their beliefs, but also in their actions. They were consistent. And I love, though, that this woman held her own against Jesus. And a lot of times we don't, I had a conversation with a male colleague earlier, and I was saying some of the same things that was just said about Jesus learning along this process. And he was like, oh no, that's Jesus. And I'm like, okay. And so I'm thinking in terms of the different ways that we as women may read this versus the way men may read, oh, this is Jesus. No, but Jesus took the time to take 3 cords and put them together and make a whip and go and turn over tables. That's the same Jesus. And so, and this woman was able to stand up and say, okay, I understand all that, but I need help. I need help for my daughter. What you gonna do? And she put it to Jesus, and Jesus responded, even though he decided not to say anything at first. And I experienced that, and me, other women may experience that. Our silencing. People want us to be quiet when we're advocating for others, but when we're advocating for ourselves as well. But we have to have a determination, and that what I hear a lot, persistence, to say, well, you may want to silence me, but I've got to get this done. And if it wasn't for the women, we all know.
Yes, but you know, but I had to say, in the church, well, not just in the church, let me be careful, but a lot of us, right, cannot see Jesus as human because of this church councils who said he is both human and divine, right? And if you see Jesus as doing something wrong, then people want to say, well, Jesus didn't sin. Right? So this is a problem for the church, I think. This is a problem. For those of us who can't see ourselves breaking with that tradition. Interesting, I have some students online saying, making the distinction, these binaries, right? Between scripture and tradition. Is not scripture also tradition?
You are so right.
So the whole Jesus is without sin thing is it's an anthropological argument. So basically, I'm actually more read in early Christianity than in Bible. And the big problem that a lot of early Christians were trying to deal with is to basically explain, like, why did Jesus have to exist? And so that's why original sin was even created, because it explains why you need to then have Jesus. So, but what happens is that when they ask the question, why did Jesus have to exist, they ran into a lot of theological problems. And so it's just like built on top of each other, like these, like, well, if the first Adam is sin and the second Adam is like cancels all the sin, well, then obviously he has to have never committed sin, otherwise it doesn't work logically. So I think that a lot of that is the reason why, like, why we're sort of saddled with this really old theology about Jesus never having sinned. But when we understand that there was a historical reason why they were even asking that question, like why they were even thinking about what the answer to that question is. But I think in our 21st century theological landscape, I don't really think we feel the need to justify why Jesus existed. And so we don't necessarily need to posit the idea of an original sin that had to be then corrected by Jesus. We can just throw it out if we want to. Although I should mention, I don't mind being heretical. So if people want to be orthodox, then I guess there might be some issues there. But I don't necessarily think we need to like stick to 3rd and 4th century theology if we don't find it useful anymore.
I agree with you on that. Why is it that we think we should not question certain traditions, right? When to me, there's even scripture in the Bible, like Philippians chapter 2, right? That calls that into question, I think. But we ignore it, and we ignore the scriptures and the thought that God wasn't doing anything before then, right? That God wasn't up to anything before even the canon of the Bible, right? So all of those become a little word problem, but we're not willing. There are things, many of us only willing to go so far. Like you said, we don't want to be considered heretical, right? But we go far enough just by using the lenses we use that people want to call us heretical, right? Just for using a contemporary lens. For some people, that's
all
heretical
of us.
enough, but enough to be heretical, yes.
I think all of us have that heretical streak within us just by being in the positions that we are in and fighting the fights that we are fighting. So automatically, folks are going to look at a lot of us as heretical. But I think it's interesting walking that line between what church folks would say, well, obviously it has to be this because we've been living, quote unquote, with, the idea of original sin for so long that we automatically read it into the text when it's not necessarily there. So I think part of what we have to do as critically thinking people is to walk the line of having those conversations, especially if we're still connected to churches and want to be a part of faith communities. So I think the question is, how do we have these conversations in faith communities that a lot of us are still a part of? And we did not check our intellect at the door. We're still coming into our faith communities with our intellect. And can our faith communities sit down and have these conversations without everybody saying, well, of course there was original sin because I read Genesis as one straight narrative. So how do we do that?
And how do we let Jesus just be human? How do we just let him be the human being we say he was? I've never seen a human who was half human and half, maybe in Star Wars, right? But that's not a human being. Yes, Dr. Jacob, Dr. Jacob and Mr. Teris, and I think we had a couple others, yes.
Yeah, I'm still ruminating on what Dr. Kaalund talked about on the turning of the heart of Jesus. And the conversation of the humanity of Jesus. And I'm beginning to think, racism and discrimination is a learned behavior, right? We learn from our surroundings how to discriminate from particular people. We're not born that way. We learn about how to be racist. And it makes me think that moment where Jesus calls her a dog is that, learned behavior that slips out of Jesus's mouth that then gets checked. And in that moment, you see the humanity of Jesus, right? That he too, as someone who is part of his own context, has learned something about Canaanite people that then slips out, in his, well, I mean, when I say Jesus, I don't mean Jesus. I mean Matthew's construction of Jesus, right? But there is this way in which that discrimination, when he meets the other, just slips out, and she just checks him, and she's like, "Oh no, not today," right? Yeah. And it's, I think it's important then in terms of solidarity building. What have we learned about each other in our own context, and how does that keep us from building moments of solidarity with one another, right? So yeah, those are my 2 cents.
Yeah, I think all that conversation, all that she has to do is wasting time. And meantime, her daughter is still being tormented. Yes, Pastor Teris.
Just furthering the conversation of the humanity and Jesus' divinity. I want to take it back to many African traditional religious perspectives say that we chose this before we got here. We say that this is the process of us becoming more divine, of us expanding our God consciousness. And so everything that we meet on the road are those impetus, those little strikes, those little things that happen to make sure that we're expanding in that way. And so this was that for Jesus, and for Jesus to be corrected and for Jesus to take that correction, to me, is divine. I've seen a lot of men in power that want to cover up what they did. Come on, somebody. They want to
yes, becoming more human too.
I'm wrong. I sit here 10 toes down, flat-footed. You just corrected me. So that is divine for a man in power to do that in the first place.
Thank you. Yes, Dr. Kaalund.
Yeah.
Before you start talking, would you please begin putting your questions in the Q&A? If you have questions for our panel, please put your questions in the Q&A. All right, Dr. Kaalund.
Just really building on something that Dr. Parker mentioned in terms of bringing critical lens to the text. And one of the things we do, or at least that's what I was doing with bringing forth this idea of the change of heart of Jesus, is just asking the questions that kind of come to me as I'm encountering the text. And another one of those questions is, does Jesus now have a new understanding of his mission? Because his understanding of his mission, as we hear it in this passage, is that he was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel, right? That's his understanding of what he was here to do. And you know, we all been watching Hamilton, right? I've watched it a couple times, too many.
No, I haven't. I wish I was, but anyway, yeah.
And it reminded me of that song, "The World Was Wide Enough for Both of Us," or "The World Was Enough," I think is the name of the song. But the idea is that the world is big enough, right? It's this abundance and scarcity, which I think is important for us to understand, is also a part of this conversation. The world is big enough for God's plan to include the Canaanites. The world is big enough, right? To include all people in God's plan. It's our inability, right? It's what we have taken on, what we understand, the colonized mind, if you will, that limits our ability to see God or to see the divine, right? It's our limitations on those things that hinder us from saying, well, Jesus is human in this passage, becoming divine, or that make us afraid to approach the text in that way. Our own kind of limits that we place on our faith, perhaps, in our text, as opposed to being more expansive, right? And operating from a space of abundance.
Yes, you know, yeah, definitely. You know, we're reading this course I'm teaching about eviction, right? And one of the problems we don't fix poverty is because we allow, because we don't want to distribute our abundance, right, to include the poor or the less fortunate. We want to allow it to float to the top, very strategically float to the top, right? Yes. Dr. Parker.
Well, Reverend Bryan first, because I think she's been trying to get.
I'm sorry. Yes, go ahead. Thank you. As Jennifer was talking, I'm going back to the text. Go ahead,
yeah. Thank you, Dr. Parker. So I was thinking about, you know, we're talking about the church context, and we teach hypostatic union and kenosis, but one thing people still cannot reconcile is the humanity of Jesus. And so they reconcile the humanity of Jesus just enough to where they feel comfortable. But in looking at this text, as Dr. Jacob said, how do you, and I'm piggybacking, how do you reconcile a Jesus who is xenophobic? Mm-hmm. How do you reconcile Jesus who is using disparaging language that is cultural, mm-hmm. right? And so we want to gloss over these texts for a sense of comfort, and not realizing that we are really becoming complicit in these behaviors and these actions that have been acceptable within society. And so I think that's a greater challenge for the church in teaching the humanity of Jesus and not so much the divinity, where people cannot attain the divine Jesus, but are more comfortable in seeing that divine Jesus through their social location, whatever that may be.
Yes, you know, we need to quit making excuses for Jesus and check him, because if we don't, we don't check ourselves, and we don't check people like, you know, that guy in the White House.
Yeah, but I think, wait, can I add on to Dr. Kaalund and Reverend Bryan?
Yes. Oh, sorry, yes.
Because, thank you, because I think that, and I'm also looking at Hayden Ward's question. She's asking about Matthew's discriminating lens. And I kind of think that if we do what Dr. Kaalund has said and read the text with the before and the after, mm-hmm. when Jesus feeds people, he takes up 12 baskets of loaves. And so 12 must mean something. And then after the conversation with the Canaanite woman, he feeds again, and he takes up 7 baskets of bread. So 7 must mean something. So Matthew's overarching narrative, I think with Jesus in the middle with that conversation of the woman, you have the change of heart. You have something happening where Jesus had to confront his own ethnocentric nature, perhaps. And then the Matthean writer kind of lets us know that now what is coming about is for more people. and that Jesus had to confront that in his mission and his ministry. So I think that's how we begin to let the text just teach us what it wants to teach us, and allow our folk who we may be preaching and teaching to go along with that text. Now, I do this every year in an intro class, and every year I get students who are like, oh, you can't say that. And I'm like, but we're just reading the text straight.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So I think that's how we have to do that.
Yes, yeah. You know, I was looking at Matthew, but I had to remember that when I read the story, I purposefully chose Mark because of the stuff that Matthew adds, and I was trying to see if he did the same thing that Mark does. And what Mark does is when Jesus mentions children, they use teknon, the Greek word teknon. When she mentions children, they use paideia. Right, and then there's a change in his attitude when you see this switch with this language as you go on in Mark, but you don't see that. I don't see that in Matthew. So this is a question. I think this is an important question, right? Then what is her faith in? Evie Glass asks, what is her faith in? Anybody want to? I think we somewhat covered that when we talked about how people believe her faith must be in Jesus. Yes, Chitra.
Yeah. Her faith lies in the fact that even when her own identity is brought to question, when her own credibility of asking for a miracle from Jesus is questioned, she is daring to ask Jesus that your perspective on looking at this issue is wrong. You are saying that I don't want to throw the bread to the dogs, but the woman is asking Jesus to take a different angle at the whole issue and say that, why don't you see the universal access to food for all people? So it's a whole, altogether change in the whole perspective of looking at the issue. So here, it is not just asking for a miracle from Jesus, but it's also asking Jesus to change the whole perspective on the issue. That is where she exhibits a bigger level of a bigger amount of faith. So it's all about asking you change the whole perspective on the whole issue, and you look at it in a altogether different perspective. That's where her faith lies. And this is relevant for us today to challenge the systems and structures that keep us in bondage.
Yes, and I
think differently.
Yeah, and I think one of those is this notion of faith, that you have to have a certain amount of faith, and then you're blaming people who don't have healing and so forth, or in certain situations, you don't have enough faith. I hear that a lot in the Bible. I'd like to say her faith is in, metaphorically, universal health care. I'd like to say that her faith is in, she's up, the word in the narrative, the word has gone around, that Jesus has this power, is healing folks for free. And this is what she's coming to get to.
And she didn't put down.
Yes.
And it's met with resistance.
Going back to Jennifer, there's enough for everybody. There should be, right? He's already distributed it free, this power. So hey, why can't I have some, right? Her faith is in the universal, metaphorically speaking, health care that he's been given to everybody else. So why does she now have to show a health card that says great faith?
And
I love that.
So do you think, yes.
And she's met with great resistance.
Yes, great
so
resistance.
She has to advocate strongly, right? And use her voice, insert her agency for the healing of her daughter.
And I'm thinking in terms of Serena Williams.
Do you have health insurance? Yes.
Could I also jump in? I also think her faith is in her, what is it? The confidence and her firm belief that her daughter is an equal.
Yes,
and
that she
deserves
deserves.
dignity,
That
right?
she
And I mean,
deserves.
and I think connecting back to Breonna Taylor, you know, that's the point, is that you cannot focus on one aspect and ignore the other. You have to talk about the dignity of Black bodies, male and female, right? So in that sense, I think, yeah, it's the dignity, and she's not going to give up on that.
Thank you. Coming to you, Donna.
Okay.
You know, thank you for going to the dignity of all bodies, right? The dignity of all bodies. Now, Jesus puts this tradition out there, right? Right? And we like to put scripture, for example, in our theological constructions in the Bible as more sacred than human life. And I think she also pushes him on that. My child is sacred, more sacred than this tradition you're putting in my way, right? Trying to put it, make it as a roadblock. That becomes a roadblock. Yes.
I love it. I think of in terms of Serena Williams, who had to advocate for herself, and that scenario where she's having a baby and she's telling them, okay, I know what's going on in my body. I need help. She has all these resources, and still a woman who is a Black woman having a baby, and her life and the child's life is in danger. And so how many times do we find ourselves advocating in detrimental positions when our life is at stake? And we have to really press the issue. We will not be silenced. And if she had been silenced, and knowing what was going on with her situation and in her body, if she had been silenced, we may not have Serena Williams, and we may not have her child with us even today. So in thinking of healthcare, especially mortality rates for Black women, is really a disparity. So thinking in terms of motherhood, what a mother has to do with a child not even born yet, in advocating for herself and for her child, is oftentimes a horrendous burden upon a Black woman, just I think many times for being Black, and just seeking what we need. I know many times I need pain management, and I have to really advocate for myself, because it's like you're supposed to be able to take the pain. No, I have a low tolerance for pain. This may be not your typical thought about Black women, but that's me. And I'm going to advocate for myself, and because I'm paying you to provide a service for me, and I'm going to get my service. And so we have to be, I think, mindful of how we as Black women or women of color are treated in a variety of realms in society. Healthcare really is problematic for us. It really is. And it's not just about childbirth, it's just about in general. Yeah. And so we've got to stay on the line for one another. I think we do this somewhat in my area of community work. I do a variety of advocacy, and that's one issue that we are really talking about as far as healthy moms and healthy babies. What does all that entail? So we've got to stay on the line, I think, and be a voice, not just for ourselves, but we don't know who that may help later on.
Yeah, but I'd like you going back to this her advocating, even though she's in this instance advocating for her child, that we also must learn to advocate for ourselves, because a lot of women are burdened with advocating for everybody else but themselves, right? Standing up for everybody else but themselves, right? And allowing ourselves to be walked over. That is not self-care. I think we can be better advocates if we also learn to advocate for ourselves.
I think that's the burden of the strong Black woman.
Yes, yes.
Dr. Shanika Walker Barnes, who I studied with at Shaw, really opened my eyes to the dilemma. I mean, it's a paradox. We have to have faith, and here we find that in the text. We are told you got to have this enormous amount of faith, or you could have a faith of mustard seed, either way. And then it's that same faith that turns on us because our bodies are used and abused. Because they're telling us we should have to do this and do that and do all these things and be all this for everybody, and we can't do it. And so there's a paradox there for this strong Black woman, and I must say here that it is a myth. The strong Black woman is a myth. However, there's so many things and decisions that we make that are detrimental to our health in the long run that we've got to sometimes check ourselves and make sure that we're doing that self-care and looking out for, as people say, number one. But that's difficult sometimes for Black women because we're often, even in the church, placed in a position where we're looking out for everybody but ourselves.
Yes, and sometimes we're demonizing poor women, right? Poor women of color, poor Black women. Looking on the outside, not taking care of their children. Well, if you are not well, right, it's quite hard to take care of your child. If things, we're reading this book, Eviction. If your time is consumed trying to find a place to live, you cannot take care of your children, right, properly. As much as you would like to, because first you got to find a roof over their heads, right? And while you're doing that, your health is failing, right? Okay, so do you think this story emphasizes the idea that to achieve liberation, both the oppressed and the oppressor have to work together? I think everybody would say yes, but in a sense, but in what way? Right? Yes.
I also want to put out there that it's also oppressed people coming in solidarity with one another, because the overarching oppressor is Roman Empire. And so what does it look like when those who are constantly oppressed by white supremacy come together and build against white supremacy? That's what I think the overarching story is.
Yeah. And the oppressor has to be committed to, like in our context, anti-racism and do some of their own work before we can work together, right?
Right.
And there is such a thing as the concept I'd like to talk about in actually a church asked me about that. What do you do when white people want to take over? Well, many times we have to put them in their place and say, okay, not this time. My response was kind of, I guess, appropriate or politically correct. However, I don't have a problem putting people in their place, and that gets me in trouble a lot too, that sass and back talk. And so, but we do have that concept of the white savior. And so we have to recognize it for what it is, and is many times just so white people can feel good about themselves and say, it's not me, it's them. And so for me, I don't have a problem helping people define that fine line, that gray area where, okay, you sit back on this one and let us take care of it. All we need you to do is to share the resources. You got all the resources. How about you share those and then we could do it ourselves? Yeah. And so I think we have to be mindful of that. That it's good for people to want to help sometimes, but they have to understand where their place is.
Yes, I like the young people leading the protest. They didn't wait, for allies, white allies, but they came. Right? That we have to be willing to move forward and not wait for us to be able to work with oppressors, right? Because they got to let go of some of that that privilege and power and so forth. And Sharon, did I see you?
Yeah.
Okay.
So then
So two people, Chitra and then Pastor Teris.
okay. When the oppressor is willing to work with the oppressed, the oppression will cease to exist. But the problem is always the oppressed is longing for the oppressors to come to conversation with the oppressed. Where do the oppressors take the initiative to come to work with the oppressed? So when I think the solidarity of the oppressed, different kinds of oppressed, is very, very essential. After we identify the oppressor or the system of oppression, we need to work on the solidarity of the different kinds of oppressed people. For instance, as I come from India and engage in this conversation is a sign of the solidarity of the oppressed. So perhaps instead of longing to find ways to get the oppressor in our camps, we need to look for the various oppressed to come together and to identify the oppressor or the system of oppression and pull in our energy to work against.
Anybody else on that? So this is question, is it possible Jesus is lifting the Canaanite woman up to, I like to say she lifted herself up. Is it possible that Jesus lifting her up to school the disciples who previously seemed to want to go along with the closeness? You might want to tackle that. I mean, you look at
could you repeat that question again, Dr.
Okay. So it says, is it possible that Jesus is lifting up this woman, she says her, to school, right? That is to teach, in a sense, the disciples who previously seemed to want to go along with the closed,
I think it's supposed to be closedness.
Yeah.
So I actually, this is really interesting. This is a super interesting question. And I actually wanted to look at the woman with the flow of blood to see whether it was the same in Matthew, but it's actually a different gospel. But one of the things that does happen periodically is that the disciples just show their asses. And I think this is one of the places where it's true, as someone remarked earlier, that Jesus's silence emboldens them to be particularly mean, but it's definitely not the only time when I think that Jesus is like, okay, I think you guys went a little farther. So I think so, at least, or I think it's a possibility, and it's a really interesting possibility because it just sort of goes along with the trope of the disciples being particularly clueless.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder, why can't Jesus be as blunt with them as he is with her? I mean, is that his sexism there? Be as blunt, as he is capable of being at other times with them, perhaps, as he is with her. Yes, Pastor Teris.
I was going to say, I totally agree with you in that. Sometimes that perspective is an attempt to want to restore Jesus and keep him without needing to be corrected. But the sister challenges Jesus, and he stands up. He stands up to the plate, and what it speaks to then is an overarching submission to ideals, to yield oneself to the ideal of rightness. And so it doesn't really matter, your shape, your form, your fashion. It's just your willingness to yield. And she, having the great faith, she had the greater faith because she was, the elasticity that she showed. It's almost like we see Black people that were willing to be in blackface. We're willing to do whatever. We see women that are willing to dance in G-string. We see people willing to do whatever little semantic willingness, whatever hoops they have to jump through in order to get the need met and get the big picture painted. And so I think that I see a hero in her, and I don't want for us to miss that's where the location of the heroic act took place.
Okay, so this
I think
yes, go ahead.
I also think, you know, rather than seeing it as Jesus is lifting her up so the disciples could learn something, the interaction between Jesus and the Canaanite woman is revelatory for the disciples to check their own xenophobic selves before they go in and interact with someone else. And I think that's, you know, that's another way of reading it, because the disciples were the ones who first went and said, she's screaming, do something about it. So they themselves are also xenophobic, and the turn of Jesus is reflective. And I think as disciples, you know, I could see myself as one of the disciples, is my call to have my own turn of heart when I encounter someone who I have been told all my life is the other, but in actuality, you know, reflects humanity in me and I in them.
Yeah, they got a problem with humanity, period, with compassion, because they didn't want to feed anybody either. Okay, so this question, I'm intrigued by the comment from earlier that we need to center the Canaanite woman, not Jesus. In our reading of this pericope, what does it look like to take the same reading strategy to the rest of Matthew? That is, how do we amplify the Canaanite woman's perspective beyond Matthew 15? That's a good question. How do we amplify those others who are at the bottom? Yes.
Yeah, I think that's the question that becomes the mission question. And instead of being colonizing mission, just being good people with one another. Because when you get to the end of Matthew, Jesus does say, go to all the other ethne, all the other nations, go to all the other people. Well, it matters how you go to other people. It matters if you go to people thinking that you're going to do your top-down approach on people. It matters if you're going to go in and decimate other people's cultures and say that they're doing everything wrong. All of that matters. And so I think from when we think about a history of missions, that we've not centered the Canaanite woman because we've gone in, especially from European countries, and gone to other countries, Africa, or the mad rush for Africa, and have decimated cultures because we de-centered the Canaanite woman and centered I would say, the ethnocentric nature of Jesus.
And perhaps when we talk about in Matthew, that it isn't for you to always see yourself as the one being sent, right? Right. We always want to see ourselves in that position as the ones being sent, but maybe we need to sit still and let people come to us and teach us something, right? That we have a lot to learn from other people who are different from us.
And
yes.
And in looking at this text and not centering Jesus, but centering the Canaanite woman, she is the savior in this sense, as she advocated for her daughter for her healing. And so thus her being the savior of her daughter's healing.
Any other responses to that question?
Well, yeah, I mean, let the Canaanite woman tell you what she needs, right? As opposed to you assuming what she needs, which has always been the problem with colonial missions, right? We'll tell you what you need. You need Jesus. Well, let us tell you what we need, you know.
And that could go, yes, thank you. So that could go with other stories, right? Even the crowds, right? Nobody asked the crowds what they want. And we never even think about who is in the crowd, right? We never think about who are in those crowds, right? Okay, so do we feel that I'm sorry, did you want to say something else, Sharon? Oh, no. Do you feel that the remarks from Jesus were based on the fact that the daughter was demon possessed and not just in a physical healing was needed, but a spiritual healing from evil? There are some that voluntarily accept sin and live in sinful life, and others that are suffering from sickness they are born with. That's why I think this is very problematic. We need to deconstruct what it is, what this may mean to say someone is tormented by a demon. Response is yes, Dr. Chitra.
In a New Testament, when we look at this demon possession, it could refer to the psychological disturbances at the realities around people, the power structures of Roman imperialism and Jewish elitism, playing a major role in disturbing their harmony with their own selves. So we see a lot of contradictions in the realities of people when they are dominated by the power structures, which do not let them enjoy their full potential and harmony within themselves. So this demon possession could be understood as the cry for help to reclaim that harmony with what exactly this daughter is longing for. So we can see that when the power structures like racism or sexism is playing havoc in our lives, we get into disturbances within ourselves that we struggle to find, come to terms with and find a way out from that. So I think we cannot find any other meaning like spiritual sinfulness or anything in demon possession. It is a term used to talk about people's psychological disturbances with what's happening around them. An imperial colonized situation has always caused trouble for the human psyche, especially for a Dalit psyche in India or a Black psyche in American context. So yeah, that
Yes,
could be.
and I think it's an unnecessary and unfortunately a typical jump from illness or demon possession to assume that the person who is tormented is sinful. There's no need to make that jump, I think, or that the person is evil because they are ill, that because a person has a mental illness, that somehow they are sinful or that they are evil. So all kinds of illnesses, and I like that you go back to the point that I think there are so many illnesses. They didn't have medical advancements like we have, that behaviors, perhaps mental illness, some brought on by the oppression of empire, right? And by poverty. Poverty can make you lose your mind. And so forth, that have nothing to do with sin, but oppression, right? Yes, or evil. Not evil in terms of the person necessarily, but an evilness that has an impact on us, like you say, Chitra, sexism, racism, poverty, and so forth. Yes, Donna.
Two things. Mary Magdalene is, she is traditionally thought to have been a sinful woman in a lot of ways. And so I think people are comfortable with saying and believing that she, by tradition, did certain things that she did not do in the text. It's easier for us, I think, to go along with tradition because we don't have to think any further. Now, when we're critically looking at the text. So when I think in terms of what I've just heard in the question, I'm thinking in terms of adverse childhood experiences, bringing it closer to contemporary reading. And I'm thinking in terms of what we say in my work with resiliency is not what's wrong with the child, is what happened to the child. And so a lot of times we may read some stuff into the text that's not there and demonize people. We demonize, I see young people demonized, criminalized a lot of times just because there's something going on with them in their body. They just can't process. Mm-hmm. And so I think it would be good for us to have some compassion, first of all, for the condition that this young person is in, and also that her mom seems to be very concerned and know what she kind of know what she needs. And so she's persistent in that way to say, this is what my daughter needs. Either you're going to help me or you aren't. Let's get this done. My daughter needs help. And so it behooves us, let me put it this way, it behooves us not to hang so much on tradition rather than opening our mind to reading the text in light of what's there and its background.
Yes, and instead of what we've been told, we should see, right?
Yeah, let's think critically about it. And
so I'd like to give I'd like to give each of you a few seconds to say some final words you'd like to leave with our audience before we close. So we have 8 minutes. Who would like to start? Let's start with Dr. Chitra. Do you have any final words?
Yeah. The self-identification in situations where everyone else around you is labeling you, for me, is a spiritual journey. So know your inner worth as a person oppressed, and see how you can use your inner worth of self-realization of your own identity to bring liberation for the people around. And this is a challenge. The fate of this woman is a challenge to us to extend solidarity with the oppressed and also to journey with those who are suffering to ensure that liberation is accessible to all of us.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Dr. Tong?
Yeah, so I just wanted to also flag the ways in which we have to make sure to listen to the oppressed when we're in the majority. So right now we're all Christians, and we have a tendency to, as I've heard some sort of, I think there's a danger in ascribing Jesus's ethnocentrism in this particular moment to ethnocentrism of Jewish people as a whole. And in fact, just to put a pin on why this is so important, in Homily 1 Against the Jews by John Chrysostom, he specifically points to this passage of the Canaanite woman and calls Jews dogs. He said that when the Canaanite woman spoke to Jesus, Jews were children and the Canaanite woman was a dog. But now, this is what John Chrysostom says. He says it's the Jews that are dogs. Oh, nice. So I just want to say, I think it's really important when we look at these passages where maybe Jesus isn't acting well, or the Pharisees aren't acting well, or some of the Pharisees, because the Pharisees were a very large and diverse group of people, that we don't then take that as a way to just be anti-Semitic and continue to just use Judaism as a way to make Christianity look better.
Yes. Thank you. Beware of those texts where you see the Jews or the Pharisees. No, there's no group of people who are all the same. Or should be wholesale stereotyped. Pastor Bryan, thank you so much. Yes. Do you have any closing words, Pastor Bryan?
My closing word would be, in approaching this text, learn not to always, not just this text, but other texts, not always centering Jesus, but be courageous in your faith to question Jesus in the text, and not always look for Jesus to be the savior always to be the redeemer, and always to be the one who was without fault and without sin. And just to lift up women within the text and learn to look from a womanist lens, where you see the strength and the power of women in an oppressive situation, and not to become the oppressor.
Yes, thank you. Yes, yes. Taking Jesus' side all the time keeps us from being able to take other folks' side. Dr. Jacobs, yes.
So for me, I think I feel like it's so morbid. My last words, no, my words before I leave would be recognizing that decolonizing ourselves is a daily task. And this text, makes me see that if Jesus gives into his momentarily colonized self, that means I too have colonized identities that I have to constantly decolonize. I have to do that every single day. It's not one session of unconscious biasness or diversity and inclusion that's going to fix it, but that every single day I got to go in and I got to decolonize myself, decolonize the ways in which I think about people and identities and differences, and continuously work on it. So to me, that's what gives me hope in this text.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Pastor Teris. Your mic is not, let me unmute you. Okay. Okay, go. Oh. You're unmuting and I'm muting. So unmute yourself, please. There you go.
Amen. 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 Okay. Well, I just believe strongly in that, the power that she wielded in creating Jesus to become the Christ that he was. What I'm saying is that if he came to, bring liberation to the marginalized, she then highlighted that there was a cast of inferiority, even in the margins, there was this cast of inferiority. And so in placing him with her, in being able to, hey, I'll be a dog, whatever kind of dog you want me to be, in reimagining what the dog is what she did. It's almost like when people take a trash bag or some kind of Walmart bag, Kroger bag, and they say, oh, this is trash. But then there are a few of us who actually recognize that it could actually be used for something else. Like we put it on the back of the door to put trash in. So there are things that there was a colloquial understanding that she had with him. And she then at that very time challenged the notion that she was separate, challenged the notion that she was somehow different or even of a different faith, because she was kicking that metaphysical understanding to him at the time. And so being that she enlightened Jesus, we have to take it serious in our positions, in our lowly positions, in our positions of casted inferiority, in our lack, in our, lowly status. We have to take the seriousness of our own divinity at the forefront of our activity and our thoughts.
Thank you, Pastor Teris. Dr. Kaalund.
A couple of things. Once, while this text I think is encouraging in the tenaciousness of the Canaanite woman, I think, and I can blame you, Dr. Smith, on this one, this idea of great faith and the way we can create a typology, right? And so now she becomes, instead of us reading her story, we read her as a type of woman that we need to be. Right. And I think that is to bring it back to say her name, right? I think that is what we are starting to witness with what they're saying is the memification of Breonna Taylor and also the hashtag itself. And I appreciate that. I think Reverend Vanhook kept saying it's not just a hashtag, right? That it's a movement. And that's important that we remain as tenacious in our fights for justice, because otherwise it too can become that typology, right? It too can become a meme, if you will, and it replaces the actual work that needs to be done.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Dr. Kaalund. Dr. Parker.
First, I want to say thank you, Dr. Smith, for convening us. And thank you to all of the co-panelists who were just brilliant women, have so much to say about this passage. And I'm grateful for how all of our conversations came together and just, we each add something slightly different to this passage. So I'm appreciative of that. I'm minding very much Dr. Tong's words about ethnocentricity and trying to be very much aware of remembering that none of us are monolithic. There's no monolithic woman. There's no monolithic Jewish person. There's no monolith identity. And so I think we just have to be mindful of that. We also have to continue to strive for solidarity across oppressed identities. I think we have to be willing to talk to one another. And then we also have to be willing to have conversations around religious plurality. Because I'm very mindful that a lot of us come from a Christian lens. So what does it look like to begin to think about even our New Testament, our Hebrew Bible text, over more diverse lenses as well. So I think that building that solidarity, thinking about that religious plurality, and really respecting and continuing to respect one another's multiplicity and identity is to continue to do in order to make, hopefully, this world not a better place, because I'm losing hope for that, but at least take it a few steps further than where it is right now.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Parker. I keep on calling you Doctor, Reverend Vanhook.
Thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this dynamic panel and such a rich text. My last words would be, in seeking justice, we can find in the text, challenging authority, finding your voice, liberating yourself. There's hope in the hollow. No justice, no peace.
Thank you, Dr. Reverend Vanhook. And thank you so much, each of our panelists. I know our audience on Facebook and here in the webinar was so blessed by all that each of you brought to this table, to this discussion. And I'd like to just, in closing, encourage us to be careful that we don't replicate Jesus in the sense of belittling folks, that they have to stoop to where we want them to stoop in order to get our support and our help. So have a good night, everyone. Yes, good night, everyone. I will send you all a copy of the recording.